My husband wouldn't marry me unless our prenup had an infidelity payout clause. 7 years later, I finally understood why. I woke up and couldn't remember my first language. I woke up to my mom calling, and when she started speaking, I couldn't understand a single word. It sounded like gibberish. I kept saying, "What?" And she kept repeating herself until finally she switched to English and asked if I was feeling okay. I'd been fluent in Mandarin since birth and spoke it at home every single day. My parents had insisted on Mandarin only until I started school, and even then we used it exclusively in the house. But now it sounded like random noise with no meaning at all. Not even familiar noise like when you hear a language you recognize but don't speak. This was nothing. I tried to respond in Mandarin to tell her something was wrong, but my mouth couldn't form the words. I knew I should know them, but reaching for them was like grabbing at smoke. I tried to say simple things like hello or mom, but I couldn't remember how. My tongue felt clumsy and wrong, like I'd never made those sounds before. At work, I was supposed to lead a presentation for our Beijing clients who didn't speak English. I stood there in the conference room while they waited on the video call, and I couldn't read my own slides. The characters looked like abstract art with no meaning. My boss had to take over while I pretended to have a migraine, and the deal fell through because he couldn't answer their technical questions. I went to the emergency room thinking I'd had a stroke. The doctor ran tests and scans, but everything came back normal. She asked me to try writing in Mandarin, and I couldn't even hold the pen correctly for the strokes. She brought in a translator who spoke to me slowly and clearly, but it might as well have been ancient Sumerian. The translator said my blank stare was unsettling. My dad flew in from California because he didn't believe what my mom was telling him. He sat across from me speaking Mandarin for an hour straight, while I just stared at him. He showed me children's books we'd read together when I was 3 years old, and I couldn't recognize a single character. He started crying, which I'd never seen him do before. The neurologist suggested it might be a rare form of aphasia, but that usually affects all languages, not just one. He said losing a single language completely while maintaining perfect fluency in another was technically impossible. The brain doesn't segregate languages that distinctly, especially when one was learned from birth. But here I was proving him wrong. My girlfriend Lynn only spoke Mandarin and a little broken English. We'd been together 3 years and always communicated in Mandarin. Now she'd talk to me and I'd just nod without understanding anything. She tried teaching me basic phrases like I was a child, but I couldn't retain any of it. After 2 weeks, she moved out and I never saw her again. I found my old journals from high school all written in Mandarin, and they were incomprehensible. Videos of myself from last month speaking fluently at my cousin's wedding seemed like they'd been dubbed by someone else. My entire WeChat history was meaningless symbols. 28 years of memories locked behind a language I no longer possessed. My grandmother only spoke Mandarin and had dementia. I was the only person who could calm her down during her episodes. Now when I visited, she'd get agitated because I couldn't respond properly. She kept asking what was wrong with me, and I couldn't explain. The nurses had to sedate her more frequently, and my family blamed me. The Language Institute tested me extensively and determined I had no recognition of Mandarin whatsoever. Not dormant or suppressed, but completely absent. Like I'd never been exposed to it at all. They wanted to study me but couldn't explain what had happened. One researcher said it was as if someone had deleted specific files from my brain. I tried learning Mandarin from scratch with apps and tutors, but it wouldn't stick. I'd practice a word for hours and forget it instantly. The sounds felt impossible to distinguish, like they were all the same noise. My job required bilingual skills, so they had to let me go. My parents started speaking English to me but kept slipping into Mandarin out of habit, then looking at me with disappointment when I didn't understand. Family gatherings became awkward because everyone had to translate everything. My young cousins laughed at me for not understanding cartoons. I went to 3 different specialists and they all said the same thing, that what happened to me was medically impossible. Languages don't just disappear overnight. The neural pathways should still exist even if damaged. But brain scans showed normal activity in all language centers when I heard English, and absolutely nothing when I heard Mandarin, like my brain didn't even recognize it as speech. 6 months later, I still couldn't understand a word of Mandarin despite thousands of hours of attempted relearning. Then I got a call from a researcher who'd heard about my case. She said she'd seen this once before in a patient 12 years ago. The patient had also lost their first language overnight with no medical explanation. When I asked what happened to that patient, she got quiet and said they'd stopped responding to follow-up calls after reporting something else. When I asked what she meant by something else, she said the patient claimed they'd started forgetting English too, but she hadn't believed them at the time. I hung up and realized I'd been staring at the word patient on my notepad for 30 seconds because it suddenly looked wrong. I blinked hard at the notepad, but patient still looked like random marks that shouldn't form a word. My hand started shaking as I wrote other words on the paper. Doctor came out fine at first, but then the letters seemed to shift. Hospital looked normal, then wrong, then normal again. Language took me 3 tries to spell right, even though I knew it was correct. The pen slipped from my fingers and rolled across the desk. I grabbed my phone to text someone, but the keyboard seemed foreign for a second. The letters were in the wrong places. No, wait, they were right. My thumb hovered over the screen while my chest got tight. This was exactly what the researcher had warned about. The other patient started losing English too. My hands were sweating as I scrolled through my contacts. Everyone's names looked normal, but took an extra beat to recognize. I found the neurologist's emergency number and hit call before I lost my nerve. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. I tried to explain what was happening, but the words came out jumbled. I had to repeat myself 3 times before the receptionist understood. She put me through to the doctor immediately. He told me to come in right away, and I could hear real worry in his voice even though he was trying to stay calm. I grabbed my keys and wallet and ran to my car. The drive to the hospital took 20 minutes but felt like hours. Every street sign required extra focus to read. The radio sounded normal, but occasionally a word would feel wrong in my ears. At the hospital, I parked crooked and didn't care. The emergency entrance was bright and loud and full of people. I went straight to the desk and gave my name. They were expecting me. A nurse appeared within minutes and led me to an exam room. 3 other nurses followed us and kept exchanging looks. They ran me through rapid cognitive tests while typing notes on tablets. Name the objects in this picture. Count backwards from 100 by 7s. Spell world backwards. I passed everything, but certain words took an extra second to process. It felt like my brain was translating from nothing into English. The delay was tiny, but definitely there. Dr. Barnes arrived looking concerned and immediately ordered more tests. He mentioned stroke protocols even though we both knew this wasn't a stroke. This was something much stranger. He had them prep me for an emergency MRI to check for any changes since my last scan 6 months ago. The MRI room was cold, and the machine was loud. I lay perfectly still while it banged and clicked around my head. I focused on thinking in English the whole time. I repeated phrases in my mind like prayers. My name is Sarah. I live in California. I speak English. I understand English. English is my language now. The rhythm of the machine became oddly calming as I held on to every word I could think of. The scan took 45 minutes but felt like days. When it finished, they wheeled me back to the exam room. Dr. Barnes came in 20 minutes later with a tablet showing my brain images. He couldn't hide his fascination as he pointed to different areas. My language centers showed unusual activity patterns but no damage. The areas that used to light up for Mandarin were still dead, but now the English zones were flickering strangely. Not damaged, but not normal either. He admitted he'd never seen anything like this in 30 years of practice. He wanted to bring in specialists immediately. He made calls while I sat there trying not to panic. My mom arrived an hour later with red eyes. She spoke careful English, but her words were slow and deliberate. She kept touching my hand like she needed to make sure I was real. I saw her step into the hallway to talk to a nurse. Through the door, I heard her crying. She told the nurse she was losing her daughter twice. First to the language, and now maybe to everything. The nurse tried to comfort her, but what could anyone say? They admitted me for observation that night. The room was small with one window looking at the parking garage. I asked for a notebook and pen. I spent hours writing down every English word I knew. Colors, animals, foods, names of everyone I could remember. Common phrases, song lyrics. Anything to build a wall against whatever was eating my languages. Writing felt like holding onto a rope in a storm. My hand cramped, but I kept going. I filled 20 pages before exhaustion made me stop. I fell asleep holding the pen. The next morning, I woke to voices in my room. A team of neurologists had gathered around my bed, including Dr. Barnes and a visiting researcher named Dr. Sterling. They were discussing my case like I wasn't there at first. Then Dr. Sterling introduced herself properly. She specialized in rare language disorders and had flown in from Boston overnight. They wanted to run experimental tests to map exactly what was happening in my brain. They needed to understand the mechanism before it got worse, before I lost everything. Dr. Sterling pulled up a chair next to my bed and opened her tablet to show me charts and brain scans from her research files. She'd been tracking cases like mine for 10 years, and I was only the 3rd person she'd found with this exact condition. The other 2 patients took different amounts of time to stabilize, with one needing several years before their remaining language stopped showing signs of degradation. She scrolled through data while explaining how the brain usually processes multiple languages through overlapping networks. But in our cases, something had caused a complete disconnect. 2 orderlies arrived with a wheelchair to take me to a different part of the hospital for more specialized testing. We went down 3 floors and through several security doors to reach a lab filled with machines I'd never seen before. The biggest one looked like a giant white helmet connected to dozens of computers. The technician setting up the equipment made a joke about how I'd probably end up in medical journals, though they'd keep my name anonymous for privacy. He helped me onto the narrow bed that would slide into the magnetoencephalography machine, which could track my brain's electrical activity down to the millisecond. They fitted the helmet device over my head, and it felt heavier than I expected, with hundreds of sensors pressing against my scalp. The technician started the scan and told me to relax while they played different sounds through the built-in speakers. First came English words like apple and running and yellow, which sounded perfectly normal and clear. Then they switched to Mandarin phrases, and my brain heard them as meaningless noise like static or random tones with no pattern. The machine recorded everything while I lay there for 40 minutes listening to alternating sets of English and Mandarin. When they finished, Dr. Sterling came back with printouts showing colorful brain maps from the scan. She pointed to areas that lit up bright orange and red when I heard English showing normal language processing in all the expected regions. But the Mandarin sections showed almost nothing, just faint blue spots that indicated my brain wasn't even recognizing it as language at all. She called this pattern selective linguistic suppression and explained my brain was actively blocking any processing of Mandarin, rather than just failing to understand it. The difference was important because it meant my brain was protecting itself by completely shutting down those pathways. She sat down again and suggested that extreme stress could trigger this kind of selective shutdown as a defense mechanism. The brain might seal off certain neural pathways to prevent some kind of overload or damage, though she admitted it sounded crazy. I thought about the months before this started and realized the pressure had been building from every direction. Work kept demanding more Beijing contracts, while my parents pushed me to be the perfect bridge between cultures, and I felt stretched between two identities that both wanted all of me. Dr. Sterling nodded and said she'd heard similar stories from the other patients about identity stress and cultural pressure before their language loss. She wrote notes while I talked about family expectations and struggling to balance everything. 3 days later, they discharged me with a thick folder of monitoring instructions and weekly check-in requirements. They'd also scheduled appointments with someone named Joy Webster, who specialized in unusual language disorders, though I didn't see how therapy could help when my brain literally wouldn't recognize Mandarin existed. The taxi ride home felt strange knowing I was going back to an apartment full of reminders of my bilingual life. I found sticky notes I'd put up just yesterday with Mandarin labels on the refrigerator and cabinets and doors. The characters looked like random scribbles now, with no more meaning than a child's drawing. I pulled them all down one by one, feeling like I was erasing the proof that I'd ever been able to read them. My hands shook as I crumpled each note and threw them in the trash. The next week, Joy Webster's office was in a medical building downtown on the 4th floor. She had certificates covering one wall and shelves full of language books in dozens of scripts I couldn't identify. She started by having me look at pictures while she played different sounds to map which pathways still worked and which were completely gone. She showed me photos of common objects while playing their names in Mandarin, but my brain showed no recognition at all. Then she tried something different and played recordings of my parents speaking Mandarin without showing their faces. I couldn't understand the words, but somehow I knew it was them, just from the rhythm and tone of their voices. Joy got excited and said this meant some non-linguistic connections remained even if the language processing was blocked. She pulled out recordings of Mandarin songs and had me tap along to the rhythm, which I could follow perfectly, even though the words meant nothing. Her theory was that we might rebuild some connections using these non-linguistic cues like music and rhythm and tone. It seemed desperate and probably pointless, but I was willing to try anything that might open even the smallest door back to understanding my parents and grandmother again. 2 days after that session with Joy, my phone rang while I was making breakfast, and Dad's name showed up on the screen. I picked up and heard him speaking English, which felt wrong because we'd never had a phone conversation in English before. His voice sounded different, speaking my second language like he was older or tired or both. He told me he'd been practicing his English pronunciation with an app because he wanted our conversations to feel more natural for me. I could hear papers rustling in the background, and then he cleared his throat and mentioned grandmother had gotten worse at the care facility. The nurses were calling him daily now because she'd started hitting them during her confused episodes, and they couldn't calm her down. She kept asking for me in Mandarin and getting angry when I wasn't there to help. The guilt hit me hard as I stood there holding my coffee mug and listening to him describe how they'd had to increase her medication. He said the facility was threatening to transfer her to a more secure unit if the violence continued. I told him I'd try visiting again, even though we both knew it wouldn't help since I couldn't understand or respond to her anymore. The next morning at work, Graham called me into his office and closed the door behind us. He sat down and pulled out a folder with my name on it while I waited in the chair across from his desk. He explained that the Beijing accounts were suffering without someone who could communicate directly with the clients. I nodded and offered to help transition my projects to whoever would be taking over my role. He surprised me by sliding a different paper across the desk that showed a reorganization chart with my name under the English-only technical division. He said my knowledge of our systems was too valuable to lose just because I couldn't speak Mandarin anymore. The position paid less, but at least I'd still have a job and health insurance. I signed the transfer paperwork right there, and he shook my hand before I left his office. That night I couldn't sleep and kept having dreams where people were speaking to me, but I couldn't tell what language it was. I woke up at 3 in the morning with tears on my face and this deep feeling of loss, but no memory of the actual dream words. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. The sensation was like trying to hold water in my hands while it all leaked through my fingers. I wrote down what I could remember in my journal, but it was just emotions without any linguistic content. 3 weeks into working with Joy, we tried a new approach where she'd play Mandarin sounds while I touched different textures. She had me run my fingers over sandpaper while listening to rising tones and silk fabric for falling ones. My brain fought against making any connections, like trying to force the wrong poles of magnets together. She'd play a simple word like ma and have me trace patterns in sand, but nothing would stick. After each session, I'd leave with a headache from the mental effort of trying to force my brain to recognize something it insisted didn't exist. Joy stayed patient and kept adjusting her methods, but I could see the frustration in her notes. One Thursday evening, Renata Sterling called while I was cooking dinner and said she'd found something interesting in old medical journals. She'd discovered a 4th case from 1987 in Germany, where a woman lost her native Russian overnight. That patient had partially recovered after 2 years, though she never got back to full fluency. Sterling explained that the woman could eventually understand basic conversations but couldn't speak or write properly. She invited me to join her research study at the University Medical Center, which would involve intensive monitoring and some experimental treatments. I agreed immediately because even partial recovery sounded better than this complete blank nothing. The study intake appointment lasted 8 hours and left me exhausted. They ran cognitive tests where I had to sort cards and solve puzzles while electrodes monitored my brain activity. A psychologist asked detailed questions about my childhood and family dynamics, and any trauma I might have experienced. They wanted to know about stress levels before the language loss, and whether I'd had any head injuries, even minor ones. The research team took blood samples and did genetic testing looking for any markers that might explain why some brains could just delete a language. They had me write my entire life history, focusing on anything unusual or stressful around language learning. Sterling's team compared my results with the other 3 cases looking for patterns in age or stress or family history or anything that might connect us. By the end of the day, my head was pounding and my hand was cramped from writing, but Sterling seemed excited about the data. She said I was their most cooperative subject since the others had been studied years after their language loss. Mom started leaving me voicemails in English, but her accent made every word sound heavy with sadness. She'd say things like talking to me in English felt like speaking to a stranger who was wearing her daughter's face. Sometimes she'd slip into Mandarin halfway through the message and then catch herself and apologize in English. I saved all the messages, even the ones I couldn't understand, because her voice still sounded like home even if the words meant nothing. The next fMRI session at the medical center took 3 hours, and Sterling watched the monitors while they played different recordings through my headphones. First came English words and my brain lit up normally on the screens, but when they switched to Mandarin, the technician pointed at something on the display, and Sterling leaned forward to study it closer. My amygdala was going crazy with activity, even though I couldn't understand a single word they were playing. The fear center of my brain was treating Mandarin like a threat or danger signal, which made no sense because I felt nothing while listening to it. Sterling ran the test again with different Mandarin samples and got the same result every time, with my brain showing massive stress responses to sounds that meant nothing to me consciously. After the scan, she sat me down in her office and asked detailed questions about any trauma connected to the language, like maybe something bad that happened while people were speaking Mandarin around me. I thought hard, but could only remember normal stuff like getting scolded for bad grades or arguing with my parents about curfews, which wasn't real trauma, just regular family life. She took notes and said sometimes the brain protects us from things we don't even remember consciously, and maybe that's what was happening here. Graham called me into his office that Monday and said he was moving me to a new project team working on documentation for American clients only. The whole team spoke just English, and nobody even knew I used to be bilingual, which felt like starting over as a different person. I threw myself into the work and stayed late every night because focusing on technical specs was easier than going home to an apartment full of Chinese books I couldn't read. Joy tried something new in our next session where she played Mandarin tones while showing me colored cards and having me touch different textures like sandpaper or silk. She said we were trying to build new pathways by connecting the sounds to other senses, since the language pathway was completely blocked. After weeks of practice, I could finally tell when a tone went up versus down, even though the sound still carried no meaning at all. It was like recognizing musical notes without understanding the song, but Joy said it was progress. I spent an afternoon at my apartment recording myself saying simple English phrases into my phone for grandmother. Things like, "It's okay, and you're safe, and I'm here with you," even though I wouldn't actually be there when the nurses played them. Mom helped me think of what grandmother needed to hear most, and we made 20 different recordings that the care facility could use during her bad episodes. The nurses said they'd try playing them next time she got agitated, though we didn't know if hearing my voice without me being there would help or make things worse. Sunday dinner at my parents' house became this weird, careful dance where everyone spoke English, even my aunts and uncles who weren't comfortable with it. My little cousins kept whispering to each other in Mandarin and shooting looks at me like I was some broken toy they weren't allowed to play with anymore. Mom would catch them and make them switch to English, but I could see them rolling their eyes. 6 weeks into Sterling's study, she called me in to share what they'd found so far comparing all 4 cases. Every single person had the same pattern with sudden, complete loss overnight and no gradual decline beforehand or after. Most importantly, the condition seemed stable rather than getting worse over time, which meant it probably wouldn't spread to other languages. She showed me charts and brain scans from the other patients, and they all looked exactly like mine with that weird amygdala response to their lost language. The relief hit me so hard I actually started shaking, because I'd been terrified of losing English too, and ending up completely without language at all. Sterling said I should still come in for monitoring every month, but she was confident English would stay intact based on the other cases who'd been stable for years. That night, I tried texting Lynn through a translation app, typing in English and having it convert to Chinese characters before sending. The app showed delivered, but she never responded, and I stared at my phone for hours, waiting for those 3 dots that never appeared. A mutual friend told me a week later that Lynn was seeing someone new, and they'd moved in together already. She said Lynn seemed happy with someone who could actually understand her completely without needing apps or translations. The research team published their preliminary findings in a neurology journal with me listed as patient C alongside the others. Reading about myself in clinical terms felt weird, like looking at my life through a microscope. They described my case as complete selective aphasia, with preservation of secondary language, and noted the unusual amygdala activation pattern during exposure to the lost language. The paper said more research was needed to understand the mechanism, but their working theory involved the brain creating a protective barrier against specific linguistic input, possibly triggered by psychological factors they hadn't identified yet. Joy called me the next morning and said we needed to change our approach completely since the recovery methods weren't working after months of trying. She had me come in that afternoon and showed me new exercises focused on accepting the loss rather than fighting it. We started with simple recognition drills where she'd play recordings of different Mandarin speakers showing various emotions without trying to understand the words themselves. I sat there listening to angry voices, sad voices, scared voices, and slowly started picking up the patterns in tone and rhythm, even though the words meant nothing. She had me close my eyes and just focus on the emotional energy behind the sounds, rather than trying to decode meaning that wasn't there anymore. After 2 weeks of this new approach, I could tell when someone speaking Mandarin was upset versus calm, though I still couldn't respond or understand any actual words. The breakthrough came when I visited grandmother and heard her speaking to the nurse in that high, tight voice she used when scared. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but I knew she was frightened and grabbed her hand, which seemed to help even though I couldn't say anything back. The nurse looked surprised when I correctly identified that grandmother needed her anxiety medication based purely on her tone. A social worker named Ariana Mahan came to evaluate grandmother's care situation and suggested bringing in Mandarin-speaking volunteers, since I couldn't communicate with her anymore. She sat across from me with her clipboard explaining how the volunteer program worked, while I felt my chest getting tight, knowing strangers would be doing what I used to do. Ariana said she understood it was hard, but grandmother's needs had to come first, and she was right, even though it hurt to admit. The volunteers started the following Tuesday. 2 women from the local Chinese community center who came twice a week for 3-hour shifts. They sat with grandmother speaking Mandarin, reading to her, playing old Chinese songs on their phones, all the things I used to do before my brain deleted that part of me. Within a month, grandmother's violent episodes dropped from daily to maybe twice a week, and the nurses were able to reduce her sedation medications significantly. She started having more clear days where she recognized people and could eat without assistance, though she still asked about me sometimes according to the volunteers' reports. One volunteer wrote notes about their conversations that Ariana translated for me, mostly grandmother talking about her childhood in Beijing and asking why her granddaughter never visited anymore. Meanwhile at work, Graham called me into his office and offered me a permanent position on the English-only technical documentation team with a 20% pay cut but stable hours and benefits. He said my technical knowledge was too valuable to lose completely, and they'd restructured the position to eliminate all bilingual requirements permanently. I signed the paperwork that afternoon, grateful to have any job at all, even though it was nothing like the international coordinator role I'd worked toward for years. Sterling's research team published another paper identifying the specific neural pathways that shut down during selective aphasia cases like mine. She called to explain they'd found the exact brain regions involved, but developing targeted therapies would take years of trials and testing with no guarantees. Her team had mapped the disconnection between language recognition and processing centers, showing how the brain could completely wall off one language while preserving another perfectly. She said maybe in 5 or 10 years there might be experimental treatments, but nothing that would help me now or probably ever. Joy found a support group for people with various language disorders that met Thursday evenings at the community center near my apartment. I walked into that first meeting seeing people with stroke damage, brain injuries, developmental disorders, all of us missing pieces of language in different ways. The facilitator had us go around introducing ourselves and our conditions, and I explained my selective aphasia while others nodded with understanding. One man who'd had a stroke 2 years ago grabbed my arm after the meeting and said at least I'd kept one language completely intact. He struggled with both English and Spanish now, mixing them up constantly, forgetting basic words in both, and said he'd give anything to have even one language work perfectly like mine did. That comment stayed with me all week because I'd been so focused on what I'd lost that I hadn't considered how much worse it could be. The next time Mom called, we tried something new where she'd use simple English but add lots of photos and videos to help explain things. She'd take pictures of what she was cooking and send them while we talked, or share old family photos while telling stories, building new ways to connect without Mandarin. We developed this whole system of gestures and visual cues for our video calls, pointing at things, using hand signals, almost like a private sign language just for us. It felt strange at first, but after a few weeks it became our new normal, this different way of being mother and daughter. Dad flew in for my birthday in March and insisted on taking me to our favorite dim sum place downtown, even though I couldn't read the menu anymore. He ordered for both of us, pointing at items on the cart, speaking rapid Mandarin with the staff while I sat there smiling and nodding like I understood. The waiter kept trying to talk to me in Mandarin, and Dad would jump in to answer, making excuses about me having a sore throat, protecting me from the embarrassment of explaining. We ate in mostly silence, him occasionally pointing at dishes and saying their English names, both of us pretending this was normal and not completely heartbreaking. Joy had me close my eyes during our next session while she played recordings of different people speaking Mandarin. I pointed when I heard Mom's voice even though the words meant nothing. Then Dad's voice came through the speakers and I raised my hand immediately. Joy played strangers speaking the same phrases and I shook my head each time. She showed me the data on her laptop where she'd tracked my accuracy at 92% for family voices versus random speakers. My brain still recognized the unique patterns of how my parents spoke, even if the meaning was gone. We tried it with Lynn's old voicemails, and I could pick her voice out from other women every single time. Joy said this was huge because it proved some neural pathways for Mandarin were still firing, just not the ones for comprehension. The research study sent their first payment that week, and it was enough to cover the gap from my reduced salary. Dr. Sterling called to tell me our sessions were helping her team create new diagnostic tests for selective aphasia. She said 3 more cases had been identified using the criteria they'd developed from studying me. The extra money meant I could stop worrying about rent while adjusting to the lower pay at work. I spent a whole weekend drawing simple pictures on index cards for grandmother's care facility. Water was a blue cup, bathroom was a toilet symbol, pain was a red X over a body outline. The nurses helped me test them during my next visit. Grandmother pointed at the water card and they brought her a drink right away. She tapped the bathroom card, and they helped her to the restroom without the usual confusion. When her hip hurt, she pressed the pain card and pointed to where it ached. We couldn't have conversations, but at least she could tell people what she needed. Graham called me into his office on Monday to discuss a new contract his team had just landed. The client was a tech company from Seattle that needed someone who understood our systems inside and out. He said my name came up in every planning meeting because I knew the technical specs better than anyone. The project kicked off that week, and I led the documentation review without anyone mentioning my language situation. My coworkers stopped asking if I needed help with simple tasks and started treating me like a regular team member again. The Mandarin volunteers had been visiting grandmother for 3 months when Ariana called about something special. One of the volunteers said grandmother had been completely clear that morning and asking for me by name. I rushed to the care facility not knowing what to expect. Grandmother was sitting up in bed looking more alert than she had in months. She reached for my hand and started speaking rapid Mandarin while staring right into my eyes. I squeezed her fingers and nodded even though I couldn't understand a single word. She kept talking and crying and patting my face like she knew exactly who I was. The volunteer said she'd been asking why I couldn't speak to her anymore, but somehow understood I was still there. We sat like that for an hour with her holding my hand and talking while I just held on tight. The moment felt like a gift, even without understanding the words. Dr. Sterling scheduled another round of tests to check my English stability after 6 months. She ran me through hours of verbal and written assessments comparing them to my baseline from the hospital. The results showed no degradation at all in my English processing. She said most aphasia patients showed at least minor decline in their remaining language, but mine stayed rock solid. Her theory was that whatever caused the Mandarin loss had completely severed those pathways while leaving English untouched. She couldn't explain the mechanism, but the data was clear that English wasn't going anywhere. Joy suggested I try learning American Sign Language since it used completely different brain circuits than spoken language. She knew an instructor who taught beginners at the community college and thought it might help me communicate with grandmother. I signed up for evening classes that started the next week. The instructor showed us basic signs for everyday needs, and I practiced them constantly. My fingers felt clumsy at first, but the visual nature clicked faster than spoken Mandarin ever had. Joy was right about it using different pathways because I could actually retain the signs between classes. Family dinners changed gradually over the months, with everyone defaulting to English when I arrived. At first, they'd switch mid-sentence looking guilty, but eventually English became the automatic choice. My aunts and uncles would forget and slip into Mandarin, then quickly translate without me having to ask. The cousins stopped whispering and just included me in their English conversations about school and games. Each gathering hurt a little less as the new pattern became normal. The consulting opportunity came through a former colleague who'd started her own firm. She needed someone to audit technical documentation for a pharmaceutical company, and my English-only focus actually made me perfect for it. The contract paid almost double my regular hourly rate for 20 hours a week on top of my day job. 6 months after losing Mandarin, I was actually making more money than before. Mom called one evening to talk about my youngest cousins starting kindergarten soon. She mentioned she'd been teaching them more English at home to help them prepare for school. Then she paused and said it was also so they could talk to me better. She'd been reading English books with them every night and playing word games in the car. The kids were picking it up fast and loved showing off new words when they saw me. 3 weeks later, Dr. Sterling sent me a thick envelope with her published paper inside, and my case taking up 12 pages of detailed analysis. She'd changed how neurologists understood language organization in the brain, because my scans proved languages could exist in completely separate neural networks without any overlap. The paper included color-coded brain images showing my English pathways lighting up normal, while the Mandarin regions stayed dark as empty rooms. She called that afternoon to tell me medical schools were already updating their textbooks based on her findings, and 3 other patients with similar symptoms had contacted her since publication. The research changed diagnosis protocols worldwide and gave doctors new ways to identify selective aphasia before patients spent months thinking they'd had strokes. Meanwhile, the Mandarin volunteers Ariana arranged started visiting grandmother 3 times a week, and one named Mrs. O'Lock began teaching me her recipes without using any words at all. She'd arrive at grandmother's care facility with bags of ingredients and guide my hands through chopping vegetables while grandmother watched from her chair. We'd work side by side at the small kitchen counter while Mrs. Alok showed me exact knife angles for cutting bok choy and the right wrist motion for stirring soup. Her hands would correct mine when I held the cleaver wrong or added too much soy sauce. Grandmother would smell the familiar food cooking and calm down even during her confused episodes. After 6 weeks, I could make her favorite winter melon soup perfectly, and Mrs. Alok would nod approval while grandmother ate every drop. The routine gave structure to visits that used to leave me crying in the parking lot. I started noticing other changes too, like how my work improved once I stopped splitting focus between 2 languages. Graham noticed my documentation had gotten clearer and more detailed since I could concentrate fully on English technical terms. My error rate dropped to almost 0, and clients started requesting me specifically for their projects. The promotion came through email on a Tuesday morning, with Graham offering me the lead position for our entire English documentation team. The salary increase wasn't huge, but the stability meant everything after months of uncertainty. I accepted immediately and spent the rest of the day organizing my new responsibilities. My parents adapted too, with Mom teaching Dad more English phrases so family dinners could include everyone. Dad would stumble over words sometimes, but kept trying because he wanted me to feel included. My aunts learned to pause their Mandarin conversations when I walked in and switch without making it awkward. Even my teenage cousins started translating their jokes so I could laugh too. Grandmother's 80th birthday arrived in early spring, and the whole family gathered at the care facility's community room. Mom had decorated with red and gold streamers while my aunts brought traditional foods they'd spent days preparing. When it came time for toasts, everyone automatically switched to English without anyone asking. Dad stood up first and said grandmother had given our family its strength even if she couldn't understand his words right now. My uncles followed with their own English speeches about her courage coming to America and raising 8 children. Grandmother sat in her wheelchair smiling at the warm voices even though the words meant nothing to her. She could feel the love in how we spoke, and that seemed enough. After cake, I noticed something strange while helping clean up. The exit sign above the door suddenly made sense, not as English, but as 2 simple Chinese characters I recognized. Over the next days, I started seeing patterns in other signs, like the character for danger on cleaning supplies, and my own family name on mail. It wasn't reading exactly, but more like recognizing shapes I'd seen thousands of times before. My brain had kept some visual memory, even if the language meaning stayed locked away. I could identify about 20 characters total, mostly simple ones for water, fire, person, big, small. Joy said this was my brain trying to rebuild connections through pure pattern recognition instead of language processing. The fear of losing English haunted me constantly after that first phone call about the other patient. I started keeping detailed journals in English and recording myself reading technical manuals as backup proof I still had language. My savings account grew steadily as I put away half my salary in case I needed medical care or couldn't work anymore. I documented every important piece of knowledge I had and shared passwords with my parents. Mom found me one night organizing flashcards with basic English words and held me while I shook with fear that I'd wake up understanding nothing at all. She promised they'd take care of me no matter what happened, but the terror never fully left. 8 months after that terrifying morning when Mandarin disappeared, I'd built something smaller but solid with the language I had left. My job had shifted from international coordinator to English documentation lead, but I excelled at it and felt proud of my work. Grandmother got excellent care from the Mandarin volunteers who became her friends, while I supported her in other ways like managing her medical appointments and insurance. My family found new ways to include me in everything from holiday planning to cousins' homework help. The grief of losing half my identity would always hurt, but it no longer drowned out everything good in my life. And that's today's wrap-up. I always want to leave you with more than just a story. Hit subscribe and let's keep building on it.